I'm not sure how to start. I suppose I should explain how I got here. It's not a thing I ever saw myself doing. I'm not a highly trained super soldier drawn to combat or a tough guy in any way. Until then, I'd only fired a gun a few times, taking pot shots at cans and the like. My interests focused mainly on comics and video games like most guys my age. In high school, I was in the chess club and still play a lot online. When I began college, I caught the coding bug, and that is what I focused on. I graduated with a degree and got a job with a small game developer. The job's been fun, and my coworkers are really cool and smart people, a lot smarter than me in truth. Now, up until 2020, I had lived on my own for a few years. Unfortunately, that year was a perfect storm of misfortune for my family and the world at large. In addition to the pandemic, my mother made the difficult decision to divorce my stepfather. She had finally grown tired of enough of his verbal and physical abuse to kick him out. She was now responsible for providing for herself and my 12-year-old brother on one income. In spite of the odds, she was making it. Then the lockdowns began and she lost her job. This was a disaster. As soon as I found out, I moved out of my place and in with them. I quickly sold what I could and put the rest of my belongings in storage. There was no way I was going to let my family get turned out onto the streets, and certainly not while a deadly plague was ravaging the planet. The lockdowns were a mixed bag for us. My job was unaffected for the most part. All work switched off-site. The extra money I saved was put into food and other bills. My mother, who had always been very interested in vintage clothing, began reselling them on Etsy and eBay. At least on the financial front, we were eking out an existence. The good always comes with the bad, and my stepfather was nothing but bad. I had encouraged my mother to file a restraining order against him as a just-in-case measure after kicking him out, but instead, he still will be allowed to see his son. I considered other options, but it didn't seem fair cutting my little brother off from his dad. So as long as he played nice, I would mind my own business and avoid him when he came around. Fortunately, the lockdowns came to an end and we were allowed to restart our lives. I began working out of the office again and my brother returned to school. Mom quickly found a part-time job tending bar downtown. It was not an ideal situation, but a start at the least. My stepfather had to screw it up, though. He discovered where Mom was working and began frequenting her workplace. Mom had more than enough experience dealing with his crap and took his provocations on the chin. As usual, he got too drunk and pushed things too far. The night he threw a full glass of beer in my mom's face, the bouncers threw him out in his butt. I wish I could say that he learned his lesson, but bullies are often slow on the uptake. I couldn't deal with the humiliation, so he waited outside of our apartment, continuing to drink all the while. He sprang from the bushes and beat my mom mercilessly until she was able to escape into the safety of the apartment. I just happened to be away that night working on a last-minute deadline. Had I been there to witness it, what came later may have happened a lot sooner than it did. I arrived late the next afternoon, so exhausted that I could barely see, but the second I saw my mom's face, I exploded. I'd had enough. If the cops didn't do their jobs, I would do it for them. I think Mom could see how serious I was, and it scared her. I believe she came up with her plan not to stop the abuse, but to prevent me from ruining my life because of it. I was in the process of calling the cops when she asked me to hear her out. I was reluctant, but did so. No matter what she said, I still had every intent of making that call. She reminded me that the police had been involved many times before, but whether because of her reluctance to testify or just plain systemic disinterest, he had gotten off with little more than a slap on the wrist. Rather than call authorities, she proposed that we move somewhere that he was less likely to bother us. The lockdowns had put an end to any real reason for us to stay. Her original employer, along with many other employers in the area, had been destroyed. The school district, which had never been very good, was now in a shamble, and there was nothing keeping us there. I thought about it, and now that I'd calmed down somewhat, agreed that it sounded good. I may have had the most to lose, but I figured that I could probably work remotely. If not, I was sure that I'd be able to find a job using my skills wherever we ended up. And so the preparations began. That evening, we packed everything up that we could into our cars, and while we did so, I noticed Mom putting her dad's old Smith & Wesson revolver in her purse. I gave her a questioning look, but she quickly closed the purse and continued with the packing, and I kept my feelings to myself. The following morning, we rose up early and hit the road. We hadn't informed anyone that we were leaving, not even the apartment manager. Anyone who needed to know could be informed after we arrived at our new home, and even they wouldn't be informed of where. We convoyed for most of the day, only stopping for a quick lunch. About 6 p.m., we decided to grab a room for the night. I made an order for some pizzas. We'd been done eating about a half an hour when Mom got a text from my stepfather. I watched Mom turn dead pale as she read it. She just stared at the screen with her mouth gaping open. I grabbed the phone from her and read the message out loud. "Did you actually think I'd let you run away with my son that easy?" My brother and I stared at one another in astonishment. We both jumped up and ran to the window. I yanked the curtain back hard and scanned the parking lot for him. It was the worst thing that I could have done. He saw me first and began running toward the room. I yanked the curtains closed, but it was already too late. We couldn't do anything but stare at each other in dread as we waited for him to arrive. The silence in the room was terrifying. Outside, the sound of running grew closer by the second. A nauseating churning stirred in my guts, and I would liken it to waiting for a bomb to land and blow you to bits. I fought off the overpowering desire to vomit. Gradually, the clomping of his boots became a deafened pounding until nothing. For a brief moment, we started to believe that we had been somehow saved. Mom crept toward the door and carefully peeked through the peephole and just as quickly jumped back from it. Suddenly, the door exploded open and off its hinges. My brother and I turned and ran, but it was too late for my mom. She had become trapped under the door, putting her well in reach of my stepfather. He effortlessly snatched her up by her shirt and began punching her in the face as hard as possible. Each hit slung Mom's body back like a rag doll. My brother stood nearby helplessly begging his father to stop. I too could only watch as he pounded the life from her. There was little I could do. He was so much larger than me, massive and strongly built by years of hard manual labor, and I was left with only one option. The one that I had often threatened in anger but never imagined I'd ever have to choose. Yet I had little choice. He clearly intended to kill her, and if I was going to do something, it must be done immediately. Once I decided, the act was almost mechanical. I marched over to Mom's purse and pulled the pistol from it. I felt like that I was in a dream. It would be as simple as shooting a few cans. I pulled the trigger in 3 quick motions. The gun's sound deafened me and a ringing drowned out my ears. My stepfather stumbled back a moment and then glared at me with the most amazed and shocked face. It's the craziest thing. I'm still completely bewildered when I look back at it. I think he honestly believed that he was going to be able to murder my mom and take my brother with him and get away with it. It's insane, but I truly believe he thought that. I was about to pull the trigger a few more times, but he stumbled around and collapsed just outside the threshold of the door. I carefully stepped around my brother, who was in a heap on the floor, sobbing. I nudged my stepdad's body with my foot and didn't get a reaction. I looked over to my mom, who was unconscious on the floor. Her face was so bad, and I was sure that she was dead. I stuck the pistol in my front pocket and ran back around to where my phone was charging. I unplugged it and called 911. Just to be safe, I placed the pistol back in Mom's purse to make sure the cops didn't shoot me by accident. And while I waited, I checked Mom for a pulse and was happy to find that she was still alive. Help soon arrived and rushed her off to a hospital. Considering the circumstances, I had to stay behind with the police. I told them what had happened and the history we had with the subject, and they repeated the same questions over and over, I guess to see if I changed my story. And they must have been satisfied because they let me leave for the hospital a few hours later. I was instructed not to leave the city until I was formally cleared, which was fine with me. A reason for running had been dealt with after all. They did take the gun as evidence, of course, and this bothered me a little because it had been my grandfather's service weapon when he was a sheriff, and I assumed that we'd never get it back. In the end, if this was to be the price for security and peace, it was well worth paying. When I arrived at the hospital, Mom was in surgery. The doctor's preliminary diagnosis was grim. Her face and skull had been fractured along with her brain almost certainly being enlarged due to swelling. There was also some concern that she may lose sight in one of her eyes. Despite the bad news, I was relieved that she had survived the attack, and the rest was in God's hands now. I joined my brother in the waiting room. He had to have been in shock. The last few hours had been an emotional roller coaster. Most adults live an entire life not having experienced as much as he had in such a short time. I sat and watched him for a couple of minutes. He stared at the TV keenly as if his life depended on it, and I broke the silence with an apology. I wasn't sorry for what I'd done, but I still felt bad for having to do it in his presence. He turned to me and thought deeply for a long moment before speaking. "It's okay. He was an a-hole and he got what he had coming to him. I loved him, but he was a monster. Don't feel bad. Mom's alive because of you." I was shocked by his reply, to be honest. He was a very quiet kid, and I never heard him voice those type of feelings before, and I was at a loss for words, so I gave him a big hug and let it go at that. Mom came out of surgery a few hours later, and we were soon allowed to see her. I had tried to prepare myself mentally for what I may see, but I was shocked nonetheless. Her head was almost twice its size and wrapped completely, but for a few narrow tubes exiting it. I maintained my composure, but my brother was a different story. He was a blubbering mess, and I don't blame him. It was not a sight anyone his age should have to see, especially when it was his own mother. The next week was a long period of watching and waiting. The hospital was cool enough to let us crash in the room. I had also gotten us a new motel room so we could clean up or sleep in a real bed occasionally. Gradually, Mom's condition would improve, and she even managed to keep vision in her damaged eye. Nearly a month later, she was finally released. It was a day I had feared may never come, and I was very emotional when it arrived. Meanwhile, as Mom recuperated, the investigation continued. A few days before her release, I had found us all a small house to rent in town. It was beginning to look, at least for the time being, that this was to be our new home. It was a happy relief when the call finally came. After an exhaustive investigation, authorities had deemed my shooting to be justifiable, and I was a free man in the eyes of the law. The call came just 15 days ago, and I'm still somewhat shaken. I'm afraid something's going to happen to ruin our new life. Mom is improving by leaps and bounds every day. I've been able to keep my job working remotely, and my brother's continually proving to be an amazingly resilient individual. There is a small cloud looming off in the distance. Our lawyer has indicated that my stepfather's family has made threats of filing a civil lawsuit against me. He seems to think it's all talk, and I can't imagine them coming up with the resources needed to mount such a long and pointless undertaking. They are all a bunch of aimless poor alcoholics and addicts that can't even be bothered to hold down a job, and I remain optimistic considering my adversaries. I can't think of any more to include. The situation appears to be stable, and I think the biggest of our troubles has passed. Our new home is a warm and inviting place full of kind people. I wish every place was this nice. Mom has every intention of going back to work soon, and my brother has already started at his new school. It seems that after all the years my family has suffered, we may finally have come out the other side of the tunnel. The future should be bright from here on. My only regret is that a boy had to lose his father forever to get there, and that I had to be the one who caused it.
Okay, so this isn't strictly my story, but the whole thing involves my grandpa and my great aunt, a sister. But since they're no longer with us anymore, it's one of the most horrifying true stories I've ever heard. And I figured I'm within my rights to tell it. My grandpa grew up during the Great Depression in a really poor town out in Oklahoma. I mean, the way my mom tells it, they really didn't have a pot to pee in. They used to eat stuff like dandelion salad, literally just eating boiled eggs with wild dandelions. They were that broke. Even worse for my grandpa and great aunt, who were like 12 and 8 years old, respectively at the time. There's absolutely nothing to keep them entertained. They made a good go of it, turning pieces of junk into toys. Like never see that old-timey thing of a kid wiping a bike tire along with a stick? Yeah, that kind of thing. Their childhoods were just not like ours. They were accustomed to extreme boredom, grinding poverty, and back-breaking labor. So you can guess how excited they got when they heard the carnival was coming to town. There'd be games, rides, candy, sideshows, absolutely everything a kid that age could ever want. The only thing was, their family didn't have the money for them all to go. Just enough for 2 entry tickets with a little left over for cotton candy. So being the good folks they were, my great-grandparents decided they'd give the kids the money while they stayed home. Must have been like all their Christmases had come at once. The only condition was that my 12-year-old grandpa was not allowed to let my 8-year-old great aunt out of his sight. Then on the evening in question, Grandpa and Great Honor given like 50 cents between them and told me back by sundown. Then they ran off down the pasture where the carnival had been given permission to set up the way my dad tells it for the first hour. So Grandpa and Great Aunt had the time of their lives. I think tickets were like 5 cents or something. Then cotton candy was 2 cents apiece. Basically, the parents had underestimated how expensive stuff would be, so they were able to partake in everything the carnival had to offer twice. Maybe that's what led them to a false sense of security, because it certainly accounts for them staying long after the sun started to set. Only when my grandpa realized how late it was, and he started looking around for my great aunt. She was nowhere to be seen. I want to remember asking my dad why they just thought it was okay to let their kids go running around in their own like that. If it's just like an old-timey thing, or because they were so poor. Dad said it was more like because all the people going to the carnival were their neighbors. They didn't figure there was any risk. But then there's my grandpa, totally unable to find his sister, and he's starting to get worried. He started asking all the people he recognized from our town if they'd seen his sister, but they all said no. Right up until one of our neighbors said they saw my great aunt walking hand in hand with the grown-up. I think they figured it was my great-grandpa or something. But when my grandpa explains that his dad isn't even there, this guy launches into action to try and help find my great heart. So Grandpa and this random neighbor guy apparently ran away with the actual carnival and towards where the workers had set up their trailers and whatnot. That's when they heard a girl crying from inside of them. The neighbor tries to open the door, but it won't budge. So he starts banging on it. Some evil son of a gun opens the door and tries to explain it away by saying my great aunt got lost or something, that she's just inconsolable, crying in a way that Grandpa had never seen before. Scared, but sad at the same time. This neighbor then rushes my grandpa and great aunt home and tells their parents all about what had happened. My grandpa knows something bad happened to my sister, but it just doesn't know what, because she won't talk about it. Obviously, my great-grandpa was absolutely furious. So he grabs a shotgun, rounds up a few buddies, and they went down to the carnival to basically do God knows what to the sky. Again, this is all from my dad. But according to him, this huge fight starts at the carnival. People on all sides almost get shot. Then they all freeze after the carnival chief fires a gun into the air. He then agrees to parley with my great-grandpa. That after talking for like 10 minutes in some weird-looking corny trailer. As Great-Grandpa walks away from the carnival empty-handed. Everyone thought he was crazy. Some monster had just put his hands on his only daughter, and after a short powwow with the man in charge, he was happy to just walk away. His buddies confront him on it, obviously wanting to know what the deal was. My great-grandpa apparently tells him to put a sock in it, because it's all been ironed now. That night, my great-grandpa apparently puts on his boots and headed down to the carnival one more time before it left town. It meets up with this carny chief, who asks if my great-grandpa still wants satisfaction, which he obviously did. The carny chief beckons to two workers who carry out like a basket or something before laying it in front of my great-grandpa, and they invited him to open the lid. He complied, and when the smell hit him, I doubt he had it in him not to pew, because according to my dad, the carnies had stacked the offending worker's separate head on a pile of his own guts, and his own junk had been stuffed into his mouth. The carny chief then told him, while pointing at his junk, "First we cut off this, then we cut out those, then point to the guy's guts. Only when he stopped moving do we cut off that, then points to his head." Apparently after that, the carny chief once again asked my great-grandpa, "Are you satisfied?" He just nodded, turned, and then walked away. The carnival was gone the next day. I think he told my great-aunt what happened to that guy too, because she never seemed to turn off about it. No, something really bad must have happened. They killed the guy, but she actually went back to the carnival the next time it came around and borrowed a face from my son, I guess. They were built different back then and just dealt with trauma differently or whatever. Or maybe it's much easier to get over this sort of thing when you know the guy who did it suffered on Earth before he died. I suppose that's what freaks me out so much about my grandpa's story. That almost sounds like it came from a different country or something. All that poverty and vigilante justice. I just don't recognize that same kind of thing in America today. Not in such an extreme way anyways. And that sure had me counting my blessings, let me tell you.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so. Do you remember your childhood? Do you remember the games you indulged in as a child, playing hide and seek and playing tag? Some of the sweetest memories of your childhood probably. But mine are a bit different. I was born in a household of 8 siblings. It was the late 50s. I was the youngest. The oldest brother was 16 when I was born. And I remember the hazy image of my father, a tall guy, wearing a yellow check shirt almost every day, and always returned home drunk. Did not bother to ask us anything. I was too small to remember it all. But this is what my mother recalled about him whenever I asked. She told me that he never picked me up or cradled me or talked to me. I have no regrets of it. This is the story my elder brother told me. And this story was the reason we all split and were sent to other families. It all happened at the beginning of the 60s. My sister Lucille, my brother Daniel, my other brother Lawrence, and my elder brother John, they all were out in the backyard. I think they were playing tag or something like that. It was then that our neighbor knocked and he gave the 2 tickets to my mother. They were the tickets to see Elvis perform. Now, if you know who Elvis is, then you must know that what big of a deal it would be to see Elvis perform. Now, there were only 2 tickets, but there were 4 of them competing for the tickets. Everybody wanted to go, but no one was ready to back out and give the ticket to their brother or sister. My parents were conservatives, so there was no chance that they would let them easily just have the tickets for Elvis' show. So they begged and begged to let them take it. When my father returned, my mother told him about the tickets, and my father was pretty adamant about tearing up the tickets. And he said, "Well, this is devil's music. Unless y'all are the devil in disguise or worshiper of it, I would not let you go." My brother John spoke up and said that this is not devil's music, and raising a voice to your parents was surely the easiest way to get smacked. But my father had something completely else in his mind. He took the tickets and raised it over a glass jar and said, "Well, all right, if you want the tickets, you have to earn it." And that is when we put on a wager. It was simple. All 4 of the contenders will be participating in a series of games, the children games, and the last 2 standing will get the tickets. At first, the kids were relieved, and they just presumed it would be an easy bet since all they had to do was probably run or hide or do all the stuff kids do. So the first game was tag. Now, tag is an easy enough game, but our sinister parents had something completely else in mind, and they made our siblings go barefoot. And then they were made to compete in tag. At first, they didn't really understand the seriousness of it all, but it hit them. As they were told to play tag in the hot gravel and sun, and as they did, blisters popped and burned their feet. As everybody except my eldest brother gave up and went back inside. But that wasn't enough, and they set on the witch hunt. Now, it was the turn for hide and seek, they said. But as they were hiding, my parents would pinch the sibling hiding or inflict some sort of pain to get them to give up their location. But my siblings were tougher than the usual and would do everything to not give up that. Eventually, by the time game ended, Lawrence gave up and closed himself in the room, crying endlessly. But the 3 were still not ready to give up on Elvis. About 3 more excruciating games later, my brother decided that it was enough, and in a ruse of the game, he went on to call the police on my parents. And my siblings to this day recall that it was the right decision to make. None of them got to see Elvis live, but they were very much happy that they all get to be away from the abusive parental relationship. Now I watch this Squid Game, and I am remembered of the time this all happened. Later on in life, we did make our peace with Mom. She was very sorry for everything that had happened. But my dad was just another level of scary and crazy. Hey guys, thanks so much for all this support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so.